money no longer has a stable value, even in countries which have conventionally low rates of inflation around 3%. 3% is not price stability, which is why 0 to 2 was the target originally. 0 to 2, we rationalized this, as you may have seen. Genuine price stability is probably measured 1%.
Hello, I am Cody Ellingham, and this is the Transformation of Value podcast. In this episode, I talk with Don Brash, former governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand from 1988 until 2002. Don was also a member of Parliament and leader of the New Zealand National Party. We discuss Don's work at the Reserve Bank, which came at a pivotal time alongside the economic reforms of the late 80s. Don shares the history of the famous 0 to 2% inflation target that he helped implement, and we talk more broadly about the state's understanding of inflation, its causes, and the role of central banking. We go on to talk about Don's current focus, looking at both the geopolitical situation New Zealand faces in between the US and China, as well as his work with Hobson's pledge, looking at democracy issues closer to home. Now, if you would like to support my work and growing this show, please consider tipping some Bitcoin to the show's wallet. Otherwise, pass this episode on to a friend who you think may enjoy it. If you have any questions or feedback, please reach out. My emails are always open, hello@thetransformationofvalue.com. Otherwise, on to the show. The button has been pressed. I just want to make sure before we do anything that we do actually record, because it's always my fear at the back of my mind that, we haven't captured it. So,
Understood.
But Don, how have you been?
Remarkably well. For a guy my age, remarkably well.
Yeah. Is it cold where you are at the moment?
Tauranga not too bad.
You're up in Bay of Plenty.
Yeah. I moved here about 2 years ago, and I get to Auckland quite frequently. I've been there 5 times in the last 4 weeks, which is a bit unusual, but I get up and down. It's not too far, 2.5 hours each way.
Yeah, it's a bit of a drive. I know I've actually just finished reading your autobiography, Incredible Luck, and it's very fascinating because you talk a little bit about kiwi fruit as well. So I imagine you enjoy being close to the kiwi fruit. Have you still got an orchard up that way? Or?
I've still got half an orchard. I sold half of it about 3 or 4 years ago. It was too many eggs in one basket for me.
Yeah.
But that is, in fact, nearer Auckland than Tauranga. It's just in Pukekohe, in fact.
Yeah, we could get into it later, but actually I do a little bit of work in the horticulture sector around digital tools. So one of our clients is the kiwi fruit industry. So I used to get up there quite a bit, but I'm actually based in Japan these days. So I'm dialing in just from south of Tokyo today.
Oh, good.
But yeah, as I said, I just finished reading your autobiography, Incredible Luck. It was very fascinating. It sort of really gave a bit of an insight into aspects of New Zealand history that kind of have a profound impact on the country that I grew up in. And I guess I'm very interested to start talking about your time as the governor of the Reserve Bank of New Zealand from 1988 until 2002. And I think it'd be quite useful to understand the economic environment that New Zealand was in before then. Mm-hmm. And perhaps we could sketch a picture for what economic prosperity looks like in the future. So if we wind the clock back to the 1980s, New Zealand, there were periods of annual inflation like over 15%, and there was a few other structural issues. But how were you seeing things at that time? I mean, how would you broadly characterize that period?
Well, of course, it came out of a period under Rob Muldoon as Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, where everything was tightly controlled, particularly after 1981, when inflation had been high, and he decided to clamp down on wages, prices, rents, dividends, everything that moved, he tried to control. And that really wasn't working very well for the longer term. So, of course, in 84, when the Labour government came into office, they embarked upon the most remarkable range of economic policy changes that New Zealand had ever seen. Indeed, that almost any other country has ever seen. It was a very remarkable program. And I had been a National Party candidate in 1980 and 81, as you will have learned from my autobiography.
Yes.
But I was very enthusiastic about some of the stuff that Roger Douglas was doing. And years later, I read an article by a guy called Michael Cox. Michael Cox was a National Party MP through the 80s. And he said it was a very frustrating time for him because he said he didn't like the stuff that Muldoon had been doing, but he couldn't do anything about it. He did like the stuff that Labour was doing, and he was in opposition, pretending to be opposed to it. So I'm very glad indeed that I did not get elected in 1980 or 81. So it was a period under Roger Douglas and then David Cable and some of the other ministers in that government, which was quite remarkable by both New Zealand and international standards. Saw reform across a very wide range of areas. I was lucky because, as you'll know from the book, I was asked by Roger Douglas to chair the committee which designed our GST. And thanks to Roger Douglas, not to me, but thanks to him, we have a very good GST by international standards. No exemptions, or virtually no exemptions, one rate, and therefore a very simple tax for businesses to comply with. He then asked me to chair 3 other committees on rural sector taxation, on superannuation and life insurance, and one other issue, which is so complex that I won't even try to explain it on Zoom. And then, of course, he appointed me to governor of the Reserve Bank. So It was a remarkable period.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Robert Muldoon, and again, that period is very interesting for me because it was sort of before my time, as you could imagine, but it sort of led to this kind of history of New Zealand, and we sort of have inherited a lot of, I guess, the legacy of the infrastructure, but it very much seems like a different New Zealand. And I wonder that you talk about regulation in that era, but how much of that inflation was also due to government spending, do you think, at that time?
You talk about the infrastructure spending, you mean?
Yeah, Think Big and that whole era of spending.
I mean, the Think Big projects, on the face of it, were attractive at the time because he assumed that international oil prices would always remain at a very high level. So he embarked upon these projects, all of which were designed to economize on energy, or at least to control our energy to some degree. He had a synthetic gasoline plant and so on. It turned out most of those were white elephants and were sold pretty well for nothing by the subsequent government.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating, though, because I wonder broadly whether the Muldoon government, maybe, do you think they had an understanding of the nature of inflation, or is this a broader issue with governments in general?
I don't think so. At least in 1980, I was standing for national in a by-election. And at that point, the conventional national government line was that inflation was caused simply by international oil prices. The fact that our inflation rate was markedly higher than most, but not all, other developed countries seemed to pass people by. And when I was candidate suggesting that inflation was, in fact, at least partly a result of very, very easy monetary policy, Muldoon sent a minister of the Crown to Auckland to sort of tell me to sort of put my horns in, because this was not the line which Muldoon wanted to hear.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating because, as you say, the East Coast Bays by-election, in a couple of places there, sort of early in your political career, you reference the concept that inflation is caused by too much money chasing too few goods. And I think this is something we can attribute to Milton Friedman as a concept as well. Yeah. And I believe you met Milton Friedman a couple of times, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Funny story. I was running an investment bank called Broadbank in the 70s.
Yes.
My very close friend, childhood friend indeed, Alan Gibbs, was running another competing investment bank, partly owned by Chase Manhattan. And he invited to New Zealand an economist that he thought was well known and paraded him around the countryside as a way of marketing his bank's goods and services. So I was trying to think how to upstage my friend. And I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll invite Milton Friedman to New Zealand. It was a long shot. I thought the chances of him actually accepting the invitation were pretty low. But by good chance, he had planned a trip to Sydney at about the same time as I was inviting him to come to New Zealand. So he agreed to come across the Tasman for a very modest cost, the cost of his return airfares from Sydney to Auckland, and a trip around New Zealand for a week, which I was more than happy to cover the cost of. And that's where I first met him. As I say, we spent several days traveling around, particularly the South Island together, helicoptering into Milford Sound and so on. I met him on several subsequent occasions, had a meal at his home on 2 or 3 occasions in San Francisco, and he and his wife actually had dinner at my own home in Auckland not long before they died.
Interesting. I mean, because I reference Milton Friedman because He did have an approach to economics, which I guess we could broadly characterize as monetarism. And as you say, in the Muldoon era, there was this focus on the price of oil. And today, we're often told that the root of inflation perhaps lies with Cyclone Gabrielle or faraway wars with Gaza or Ukraine or otherwise various supply chain issues. But very rarely is attention given to the seigniorage of money by governments and central banks. And this is kind of the basis of what Friedman was looking at in terms of money supply, velocity of money, and these concepts. So in your book, with the East Coast Bay's election in the early 80s, you talked about, as you say, contradicting the government's official stance on inflation by saying publicly inflation was essentially the result of New Zealand monetary policy. And so do you think this discourse has gone away? Because we don't see people talking about the money supply anymore.
Well, I think that's a fair comment. Milton Friedman was very much focused on money supply in a very quantitative sense. We have not in New Zealand tended to use money aggregates or even credit aggregates very closely. I think the Reserve Bank watches what's happening on those, but there's been so much innovation in the whole financial system that it's become more difficult to interpret those as quantitative numbers. So at least when I was governor, we didn't pay much attention to the quantitative numbers at all. But we were conscious of the fact that money is crucially important, which is, of course, why we have a lever now, the official cash rate. Previously, as you will know from the book, that we had all kinds of strange levers, but not official cash rate until 1999.
Yeah. Well, do you think that you say there wasn't a focus on monetary aggregate? Is that because it's harder to track the creation of money, the systems that are in place, or is it just the economy has become more complex? Or what would you say is the cause of a move away from that focus?
I'm not sure the answer to that question, Cody. I'm not sure the answer to the question. But even when I was there, we didn't pay a lot of attention to money aggregates. We looked at the numbers, but that was not what were driving our decisions.
That's interesting. Because I do want to come back to your time at the Reserve Bank, because I guess my first question about that is sort of out of curiosity, because there was this 0 to 2% inflation target rate that came out of New Zealand, and to be fair, it is actually quite famous globally. I don't know if you know that. And this is something you were involved with, and I guess I would like to understand the rationale behind those numbers, and in particular why they have changed in recent years.
Yeah, well, I mean, the rationale for 0 to 2 was quite almost by good luck, or luck anyway. In April 1988, the inflation rate in New Zealand dropped below 10% for the first time in quite a while, and everyone said, "Hooray! We've achieved low inflation." And Minister of Finance, Roger Douglas, simply said, no, I'm talking about 0 or maybe 0 to 2%. And it was that flippant remark he made in a television interview, which became sort of holy writ. Now, when I became governor, this had become, as I say, the accepted target. And when the Reserve Bank law was changed and there was a written target between the Minister of Finance and the governor, that was what was written into it. And so just to go back on that question, the Reserve Bank Act 1989 was pioneering in a very important way. Prior to that act, there were two kinds of central banks in the world, either completely subservient to politics, as we were, as the Bank of England was. Virtually every central bank in the world was basically had control out of the Minister of Finance's office, or completely independent, at least in theory. The Federal Reserve Bank, Bundesbank, Swiss National Bank, but not many others. And Roger Douglas basically said, look, the rate of inflation is a political decision. The politicians should be the ones deciding what inflation rate should be, but they should be obliged to tell the public what their target for the inflation rate is, so that they can't play funny buggers by manipulating monetary policy for political advantage. So having agreed that the politicians, in this case the Minister of Finance, would say what the target for inflation rate should be, it almost required some kind of numerical definition, and hence 0 to 2. But of course, the quid pro quo for that, the structure was the politicians decide on the target, but leave the bureaucrats, the central bankers, to deliver the target. And when the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Act was passed, the contract was with the governor personally, not with the central bank. And I tell the story in the book about how I expressed surprise that the law was being drafted. The contract was between the Minister of Finance and the governor, not the Minister of Finance and the Reserve Bank. And the minister assured me that they couldn't fire the Reserve Bank. They couldn't even fire the whole board, but they sure as hell could fire me. And it was a very personal accountability. Now, since that time, virtually every central bank, certainly every central bank in a developed country, has a numerical inflation target. And that's now sort of regarded as the norm. Some central banks are left in the same kind of relationship with government that we had as of 89, Reserve Bank of Australia, Bank of England, Bank of Canada, Swedish Central Bank, all have targets where the target is specified by the politicians, with the central bank responsible for delivering it. We no longer have a single person accountable for that. We, like almost all other central banks, have a committee, and there are pros and cons of that framework. But as I say, for most of the last 30 years, we've had a single decision maker, but now we have a committee.
That's fascinating. And you mentioned Roger Douglas again, and I mean, this is very fascinating for me. There's actually a very good documentary on the fourth Labor government, which it's like a 4-part series, I believe, which is really quite interesting looking at that period. But in terms of Roger Douglas, I mean, if we can just maybe focus on what, from your perspective, what his vision was. I mean, coming out of this high inflation period, you mentioned these kind of remarks that he made about 0 to 2% being a good target. What do you believe maybe his understanding or conception of inflation was, and the role of government in that process, perhaps?
Well, I think he was pretty clear that the government had been responsible for the inflation rate for the most part over the previous 10 to 15 years, because they were controlling the Reserve Bank, and of course they had direct control of fiscal policy as well. And he was keen to improve fiscal policy. He wasn't very successful at doing that, in fact. But he certainly understood that monetary policy was important, and they should be accountable for what the central bank delivered. So I think he was just the most remarkable Minister of Finance. I don't think there's anything comparable in New Zealand history.
Do you know where he got his ideas from? Sorry, not to speak for the man himself, but did he study overseas, or was this something that was homegrown?
No, he didn't study overseas. There was an economist who was a member of the Australian of the Auckland branch of the Labour Party, and I've forgotten his name at the moment. He died very young, but he was a very orthodox economist, and I think that he had quite a significant influence on some of the senior members of that fourth Labour government. I think that's the truth anyway. I didn't.
If you do remember his name, I'd love to know. It's not Phillips, is it? No,
not Phillips.
Sorry.
Bill Phillips, of course, is the most famous New Zealand economist.
I see.
But no, it wasn't Bill Phillips. It was a guy who was actively involved in the Labour Party in Auckland. I corresponded with him when I was living in the United States, but unfortunately I can't think of his name at the moment.
No. If you do remember, I'll be interested to know. But I guess pulling on that thread a little bit, Don, while you were governor of the Reserve Bank, did your views on the role of monetary policy and fiscal policy change particularly, do you think?
A bit, because frankly, although I have a PhD in economics, I have a PhD from an Australian university, which, like New Zealand universities or British universities, are basically a dissertation, a 3 or 4 year thesis. Unlike the American PhDs, which you have a lot of coursework and become a generally rounded economist, in my case, I became an international expert in the role of foreign investment in development. But was I a fully rounded economist? No. I did my undergraduate degree at Canterbury, and frankly, it wasn't a very strong economic school at that time. So I've masqueraded as an economist most of my life, but it is a masquerade for the most part. And I was heavily dependent on some very, very competent staff.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I guess one other thing, just coming to your final chapter in your book, actually, you talk about, does democracy have a future? And you write that over recent years, we've seen a rage for paper money, which references James Madison, with consequently enormous erosion in the value of all the currencies of the major democracies over the last century, and aggressive quantitative easing in the US, Japan, UK, the Eurozone, etc. And I guess What are your thoughts on that? Obviously, it's important to you that it's in that final chapter. What are your thoughts on the causes of these massive expansions of the monetary supply that we have seen in recent decades?
Well, I suspect it's a consequence of political pressures. As you know, even with a 3% inflation rate, prices double in 24 years, which means they quadruple in 50 years. They go up 16 times. Yeah, it's a huge increase over a century. So money no longer has a stable value, even in countries which have conventionally low rates of inflation around 3%. 3% is not price stability, which is why 0 to 2 was the target originally. 0 to 2, we rationalized this, as you may have seen. Genuine price stability is probably measured 1%. That's at least what the Boston Committee in the US concluded. So we said, okay, genuine price stability plus minus 1, hence 0 to 2. But 1 to 3 is not, you can't argue really plausibly that 2% is genuine price stability.
Yeah, and you did hit 0%, I think, once or twice. So that was like pretty much perfect. But I just wonder though, because we also, I mean, just talking about the inflation rate for a moment. I mean, as I said, I've moved to Japan, and I did email you a couple of years ago, if you recall, and I was sort of quite concerned with inflation and the situation in New Zealand. And I think there is the official line, and we can only trust that that's been some thought and leadership has been put into understanding inflation. But really, if you look at the cost of housing and assets, and then you just go to the supermarket, it's pretty clear that it is running hotter than the numbers that are being spoken about publicly. A lot of this money has been sort of funneled into housing, as you know, and this is a perennial issue in New Zealand for young people. And so do you think maybe the way we look at inflation maybe it requires maybe a bit of a tweak or a closer inspection?
I'm not uncomfortable with the way we define inflation, but I'm very unhappy indeed about the way we push houses beyond the reach of most ordinary people. But you've had a much different experience in Japan with real estate prices than we've had in New Zealand, clearly. Very different. In New Zealand, we've had a steady escalation in residential property prices and other property prices too over 3 or 4 decades. And I think that's been extremely unhealthy and a clear consequence of policy failure.
Do you think, would you characterize that kind of role of housing, though, as in a sense replace the role of savings for people because you can't put money in the bank anymore and expect a return?
Well, I mean, you can get a return which is positive in real terms. We're just accustomed to much higher rates of interest, and therefore see 5% is pretty miserable.
Yeah.
But if inflation is effectively 0 or 1%, 5% rate of return is a good rate of return.
Yeah.
And the housing market really has been an outrageous rort, basically. Those lucky enough to get into the housing market 20, 30 years ago are sitting on a fortune. As you said, they've made apparently savings. Their wealth has increased. But for people who haven't managed to get on that ladder, they're in serious trouble.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what stands out to me. And I think certainly from the outside, housing has become a political issue. It's become a social issue. People get quite emotional about it. And I sort of try to go up the chain of kind of cause and effect here a little bit. And I certainly think part of it is due to inflation, because you cannot put money in a bank account and expect any real returns that outpace real inflation. And so the best thing you can do is buy a house. And that's where the wealth is sort of, I guess it's kind of sitting in those assets.
Well, that's what it has been, but I mean that's policy failure. Houses should decline in value as they get older. Land prices shouldn't decline, one would think. But I mean, I'm not sure how well you know Auckland, but there are 400 square metre sections, tenth of an acre in the old terminology, on sale in Drury, which is 35 to 40 kilometres south of Auckland CBD, for 735,000 New Zealand dollars. For 400 square metres plus GST. Now, that's bare land. That's not a house. Now, if you're paying $750,000 for a tiny piece of land, tenth of an acre, 35 to 40 kilometres out of the main centre, there's something seriously wrong. You know, Japan, after all, has a large number of people. We've got 5 million people. and a country which is not much smaller than Japan.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly different configurations for the countries, but I guess, I mean, zooming out again though, I mean, coming back to your career, which for me really seems to traverse two major epochs. One is the sort of mythical New Zealand of the 1970s and earlier, of protectionism, of subsidised farming, Queen Street farmers, I believe you call them, and there was that whole era. And then sort of bridging that, yourself, Roger Douglas and key figures, we moved into this kind of new New Zealand in the 1980s of the global economy, modern banking systems, globally traded currency, computerization. I mean, from where you're standing today, Don, I mean, what do you see perhaps the next era or the next epoch of banking, the next epoch of this whole system looks like, perhaps?
I'm quite optimistic. The current government appears to be determined to avoid the kind of house price escalation that we've seen in the last 30 years. Chris Bishop is the Minister of Housing. He's number 3 in the cabinet, and he has made it clear to local authorities, you must zone more land. And it's that land scarcity caused by the zoning of local governments, which is the basic cause of so-called house price inflation.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that, I mean, that's quite a New Zealand specific thing? And I guess what I was getting at with my question, though, is that globally we saw changes in all countries, you know, from that sort of post-war consensus kind of Keynesian model through to the kind of neoliberal reforms of the 80s. Right. And I guess I'm just wondering globally what the changes we maybe can expect in the coming decades may look like in terms of how government, central banking, money works more broadly.
Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that question.
Okay, sorry.
Frankly. But the issue I'm most worried about right now, looking forward, is not an economic issue, but a geopolitical one. And in Japan, you'll be very much aware of those geopolitical issues. Do we try and keep China hemmed in, which is clearly what the US game plan is, or do we accept the fact that China will be a major power of the next century?
Yeah, well, it's sort of, there is this move towards a multipolar world. You may be familiar as well with Ray Dalio's work, perhaps on changing world orders and kind of the rise and decline of empires, perhaps.
I'm not familiar with that particular book, but I've read Graham Allison's book called Destined for War. And Helen Clark and I brought a guy called Hugh White from Australia earlier this month, in fact, to talk about the multipolar world. And he thinks that we're not looking at a bipolar world, but a multipolar one where you've got US, China, India, Russia, Europe, and possibly even Indonesia down the track as being quite major powers.
Yeah, I do want to pull on that thread in a moment, but I guess if I can just describe a few principles that I'm thinking about and then pitch a question to you, Don. So we're moving into this multipolar world. We've seen some real challenges with, say, Russia, and certainly the US response in terms of sanctions, turning off the SWIFT network for payments, and this weaponization of the money, in a sense. What are your thoughts on the move towards non-state digital money, things like Bitcoin, for example?
I don't know enough about Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies to make sensible comment, to be honest, Cody. I'm inherently a bit suspicious of them. I think Bitcoin was initially sold as a way of transferring money internationally without paying banks commission. Well, I mean, given the volatility of Bitcoin prices, I'd happily pay the banks a small commission rather than expose myself to the kind of volatility which Bitcoin has experienced. I mean, you may win, you may lose, but there's nothing very predictable about the Bitcoin price.
Yeah.
So I don't see Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies as being a step forward, I must say. That's
interesting. You mentioned volatility, though. I think in the scheme of the current order, where there's again, you know, US dollar is turned off for certain parts of the world, it can be controlled in that sense. And as we also see rampant expansion of the monetary supply, I'm sort of reminded perhaps of the Weimar period where there was certainly volatility in the golden Deutschmarks as measured in paper Deutschmarks, but obviously you would want to hold the gold. And I'm just wondering, is this part of this sort of monetization of something like Bitcoin, which has generally trended up over the last 15 years since it started?
Yeah, with pretty high swings around that There's a bad trend, though. If you happen to pick it wrongly, you could lose a lot of money. Um, I worry about the stability of the international currency system. I worry about the fiscal outlook in the United States. I think the US is running grossly irresponsible fiscal deficits with not the slightest prospect of fixing that. Neither the Democrats nor the Republicans seem to be taking that seriously at all.
Mm.
And what does that imply for what you're asking me? I'm not sure, but it probably isn't good.
Yeah, well, it's just interesting because, again, going back through the history of your period, certainly I know you were able to get inflation down with your time at the Reserve Bank, but it just seems like we're in a very different social, political time today, 2024, where there is not that same ability to be the hard man who's going to steer inflation down, talk it down, make it go down. It's sort of like the debt is so high now that no matter what happens, they have to just keep expanding the monetary supply, which obviously increases the debt repayments. And socially and democratically, they can't cut spending either, it seems, in the US. It's sort of like it's almost run away at this point.
What you're saying is that democracy really is a very tenuous, yeah. And looking at the United States, you have to come to that conclusion. I mean, it's neither Republicans nor Democrats appear to be in any way serious about cutting their fiscal deficit. I mean, you make the valid point that the US has been intent on weaponizing SWIFT and other parts of the financial system. I'm very conscious of it. I'm the chairman of one of the Chinese banks in New Zealand. And if the US decided to get fed up with China, cut China off from SWIFT, I mean, the world economy would close down. I mean, it would be very serious indeed.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've certainly studied China quite a lot. I've spent a little bit of time over in China as well. I speak a little bit of Chinese myself, and I think there's this move, I don't know how you would describe it, in the media perhaps to villainize the Chinese people generally. Obviously, there's challenges with some government actions, but, we have much more in common than we have that is different, and yet it seems like there's this kind of perversive role of media kind of getting in there, and obviously, yeah, the United States is leading that, it seems.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do want to come back to that point though. Just that this, for me, again, this kind of study of history and your work and looking at even that post-war period before your time, where there was a sort of a world order. And then sort of the moment in the 80s when you were doing your work with the Reserve Bank and the early 90s. And then today, it really seems like coming back to this idea that there is a rage for paper money, and that the idea of sound money, which I imagine you've come across, and that we're seeing stuff like, have you come across the BRICS project at all? Developing their own currencies, etc., sort of outside of the US?
Vaguely, but I mean, it's hard to see that working. I mean, the BRICS countries are not, for the most part, obvious always allies. I mean, India and China have considerable tensions, and while Russia and China seem to be getting on fine at the moment, traditionally they've been not necessarily close allies. So I'm dubious about how realistic it is for a BRICS currency. I think it's more likely that you might see just more emphasis on the Chinese currency. Now, clearly that's not true at the moment because they're on tight controls. But given the economic size of China, it seems to me the plausible world could easily be a greater role for the Chinese currency.
Yeah. Well, also, I mean, looking at the US dollar, though, we've seen recently more and more countries dollarize. I mean, certainly Argentina is one example of a country that informally has dollarized. And so we're seeing more and more people outside of the political spectrum of the US mainland being exposed to, obviously, US inflation and monetary policy.
Now, when you say more and more, I mean, Ecuador, I think there are a couple of small countries in Central America have adopted the US dollar, but it's not a great number, is it? I mean, Argentina has tried more than once to hang on to the dollar and has failed. I think the only example of a long-term hold on the US dollar would be the Hong Kong dollar, wouldn't it? That they don't use the US dollar, but it's tightly pegged.
Yeah. So you think there's more chance for the Chinese RMB to take that place as a currency?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not sure, obviously. But Argentina I admire their courage, but it's yet to be shown that the new president can pull that off. I hope he does, because Argentina's a basket case in terms of economy.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic. Most of the major central banks in the world seem to be focused on keeping inflation low. Okay, that means around 2 to 2.5 to 3, which is not super low, but it's not Weimar Republic or Zimbabwe.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I mean, being able to print your own money means you never really go bankrupt in that. It's only when you've got those overseas denominated debts, and that's obviously where borrowing in US dollars, for example, can cause issues. But I still think, I mean, you've mentioned, a couple of things here. I mean, certainly I'm very interested in Bitcoin personally as a non-state third-party money. Certainly, I just was talking to someone earlier today about how they can use Bitcoin to send money to their friends in Gaza. And I know also Ukraine or Russia, either side, you can send money to friends and family, which again gets around sort of this massive system that we've built up over the last few decades of the banking kind of infrastructure. And so I'm wondering whether in increasingly multipolar world, increasingly chaotic world, kind of the ability to cut through and be a bit more direct, a bit more peer-to-peer has utility potentially.
Well, you'd think it would have, but I mean, the Bitcoin price, I haven't followed it lately, I must say, but my impression is it's not exactly stable. Is that fair comment?
I think if you look at it over 4 to 5 year spans, it generally increases in value, but day to day there's relative stability. But the trend has always been basically from zero value in 2009 to being, I think, about 60,000 US dollars today. And so, because at the core mechanism for that, Don, is it's a fixed supply. So in that regards, it's often sort of people talk about gold as similar, and I mean, have you got any thoughts on that in terms of going back to, say, even looking at the gold standard historically? Is that something you've looked at?
No, I haven't, to be honest.
It's interesting because I think New Zealand, historically, I mean, we were on the New Zealand pound, which was pegged to the British pound, I believe.
Correct.
Which was in itself pegged to gold in the early part of the 20th century. But, I mean, there's this argument, and I mean, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. If you go back to that period prior to World War I, you had, a gold standard effectively, and the country of New Zealand was built on that standard. The railways and the cities and everything was built under the gold standard, and that obviously got removed to pay for World War I, and we never really went back to it. And I mean, is that something you've looked at all, that sort of historical role of gold?
I haven't, to be honest. When I first became governor, I think I mentioned in the book, we had a small gold holding at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, but it was so tiny, I thought this is not actually going to do anything substantial. It's just a sort of a speck, so we sold it. Got a good price at the time.
How much gold was it roughly, if I may ask? Do you know?
I think $20-30 million. It was peanuts. It was very, very tiny.
Oh, I didn't know that. So the Reserve Bank of New Zealand once held gold, and now it sold it off. And is it holding any assets at the moment that you're aware of?
It holds, I think, no gold at all, as far as I know. It'll hold foreign currencies. I mean, it'll hold U.S. treasuries and the government obligations of major OECD countries.
Interesting. Well, that's fascinating. And I guess if we go coming back to a high level, I am just keen to sort of wrap this section up in terms of perhaps the principles that you use for looking at the way the world works. Is there sort of ideas or concepts that you always a lens through which you see the world and understand it?
No, I don't think I can enunciate a sort of a brash theory of the world. No, I was lucky enough to start at the Reserve Bank at a time when they were committed to making major change, and the basic framework had been decided before I became governor. I've just happened to be the lucky guy who got to put it in place. And it was an extraordinary time. You would have seen in that book or the chapter on the Reserve Bank the way in which the government squeezed efficiency into the operation of central banks. Central banks around the world are, by definition, the least efficient part of the public sector because they print the stuff and they live on the seigniorage income of issuing currency. and they take it for granted that they have first cut on that average income. And of course, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand Act 89 changed that. We no longer had any automatic entitlement to seniorage income, and that drove major efficiencies, as you'll have seen.
Yeah.
And central banks are just all over the world grossly inefficient. I don't think there's any exception to that, except the Reserve Bank of New Zealand used to be. I'm not quite sure how efficient it is now.
Yeah.
But I never forgotten being told by, I think the head of the Bundesbank at one stage, that the Bank of France had 50,000 staff. And I said, but that's what you've got. He said, yes, it's far too many. But I mean, 50,000 staff, what do you do with a central bank with 50,000 staff? I mean, it's just absolutely crazy.
Well,
but central banks are like that.
I must say, though, again, this is something I respect when you talk about that period. I believe, I might be incorrect with these numbers, but I believe you got the number of staff down to about 150 at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand.
I think 185 when I left.
Okay.
185.
And then I look at it today, and I guess with this show and with my work, I do try and communicate some of my thoughts on Bitcoin to the Reserve Bank, and I understand they're almost at 900 staff today or something like that.
I don't know what the current figure is, but I know it's much higher than it was when I left.
And I often wondered on sort of what everyone's doing, because that there's a lot of research, a lot of things getting commissioned, but when you're inside that entity, you're sort of obviously going to be biased as to what you write about.
Yeah, I think the Reserve Bank has become a bloated institution. The governor will say yes, but we've had to take on many more functions than when Brash was governor, and that's true. The government has dumped on the Reserve Bank responsibility for insurance companies and non-bank deposit takers. That was not the case when I was governor. So yes, they've had more responsibility put on them. I think incorrectly. I think it's been a mistake.
Yeah,
we've adopted the international approach to banking supervision, which is very intrusive.
Well, this again comes back to what you were saying, though, when you were coming in the 80s, that there was this over-regulation and it was just hard to get anything done. And you kind of cut through all of that. And now it's grown back.
It's gone back a long way.
And I just, again, this comes back to what I was talking about, though, in terms of these two eras that your career sort of spanned, where the old wood of post-war, Robert Muldoon kind of got cut out with Roger Douglas and yourself, and now we're moving back into this big government. And I mean, even on the fiscal side, how many ministries do we need? And I don't want to go down that route because I'm much more interested in the money, but it seems as if New Zealand has kind of forgotten the innovation that came from New Zealand originally around small government and effective institutions.
Well, particularly in the banking supervision responsibility of the Reserve Bank, I recall giving a major speech on the New Zealand approach at the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, annual meeting in Basel. And I was told by Alan Greenspan and by one other central bank governor, whose name I haven't ever quoted, so I won't. Both of them told me that the New Zealand approach was absolutely the right, but for political reasons they couldn't do it. And I think central banks or bank supervisors, some central banks, of course, some non-central banks, are hiding for nothing, because banks fall over typically for one of two reasons: fraud, and central banks have found themselves to be incapable of detecting fraud in a couple of cases in recent memory, or last 20, 30 years anyway. One of them failed in Singapore. Monetary Authority of Singapore is a very good supervisor, but they didn't pick up this fraud. Another one took place in the UK, and they began a very intrusive banking supervision system, but they didn't pick up fraud. The other reason banks fail, of course, is a drastic change in real estate prices, and central banks are no better forecasting that than banks are. So the idea that central banks can make a material difference to bank stability, I think, is an illusion.
That's fascinating. And I guess on that note, something that I'm quite passionate about is understanding, I guess, again, the future of money. And, obviously I'm interested in Bitcoin and these technologies as, something to look at. However, the Reserve Bank of New Zealand today is doing quite a lot of work on the CBDC project. Is that something you've come across?
I'm aware of the fact they are doing the work on that, but I don't know what the stage that they're at on that point.
So it's very interesting for me because it seems as if I have very strong opinions on this. I think that cash is important, having lived through Cyclone Gabrielle and all of that, knowing the importance of physical cash, but also the understanding of the role of censorship and the sort of the weaponization of money in terms of political dissidents and people who the government thinks ought not be able to use money. And I think this is a very slippery slope, Don. And my concern is that certainly I haven't been able to get an audience with the Reserve Bank of New Zealand despite my attempts, and they sort of seem to be doing it themselves, and they don't, in my opinion, have the facilities to take public engagement on. How do you run workshops about something as important as money when you've got no capabilities at all in that space? It seems like there's just a bit of a mismatch there. What are your thoughts?
I think that's right. The Reserve Bank Adrian Orr has said there will always be some physical cash. And I think that's a commitment which I'm sure he takes seriously. I don't carry physical cash, I must say, anymore. And I'm sure that's true for many people. It's a bit odd. Former central bank government doesn't carry any cash at all, but really is not necessary for the most part. I mean, the payment systems are so good that cash is really sort of superfluous.
Yeah. Well, I guess, they work, but then again, FPOS went down the other day, and again, my concern in a stable economy, in a stable democracy, everything's okay, but when you start saying things that are critical of the government, or I just have to think of Hong Kong or other places where, there is maybe lack of transparency around what is acceptable in terms of what you can say, what you can't say, and then what that leads to in terms of debanking. And certainly democratically here in New Zealand, if you say the wrong thing in regards to the Treaty of Waitangi, for example, at what point in the future is that going to mean you get your bank account turned off? For example, that's where I guess where my concern lies, is that political role of digital money.
I think it was Nigel Farage, wasn't it, who lost his bank account in the UK?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a serious issue. Hasn't been really an issue in New Zealand today.
Yeah, I just wonder whether though it could come down in the future, but perhaps we'll just have to wait and see.
Yeah.
And I guess just one more thing on that note though, the concern I do have though is that I don't know if this innovation in digital money is something that should or ought to come out of the central bank. I feel like it's very much in the private sector, or it's a global thing. Again, looking at something like Bitcoin. And I wonder whether the technical expertise to execute this even exist within New Zealand, or whether we become subservient to technology stacks from overseas, and all sorts of things like that. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. I don't have a sensible answer to it. But to my mind, one of the great protections for all of us is that we can move money outside New Zealand. We no longer have foreign exchange controls. I don't like the way that New Zealand money is trending in terms of value, or in terms of my ability to use it freely. I can move to Australia or the US or anywhere. And that's a very important protection, I think.
Yeah. Well, you do mention capital controls in your book at some point, I believe, as being one of the, certainly it's a red flag. But in many countries around the world, there are capital controls, your ability to get the money out. And China is one of these, as we know. So would you say that's a positive for New Zealand, that we do at least have that freedom of
Absolutely. Very important indeed, since March 85.
Yeah, fascinating. Yeah,
actually earlier than that, slightly earlier. Yeah.
Was that associated? Is that at the same period as the floating of the dollar, or is this a different period?
Floating of the dollar was March 85. I think the removal of controls was a couple of months earlier. I think from memory, December 84. But it's very closely timed in terms of timing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, look, Don, thank you so much for your thoughts on all of this, these topics. I am keen to just understand maybe what's next for you, what you're looking at the moment, and sort of what's on your horizon.
Well, I'm still chairman of the New Zealand subsidiary of ICBC. That I should have retired from that years ago, but they seem to be very keen for me to stay on, so I'm still doing that. The other two things, I've got one of the directorships of an industrial property company as well, but I've got two other main focuses at the moment. One is an organisation called Hobson's Pledge, which is basically argues that there should be equal political rights for every New Zealander, not irrespective of their ethnic background. And we've got 125,000 members currently, so it's quite a large lobby group for New Zealand. And the other thing I'm focused on is geopolitics and New Zealand's foreign policy. Do we want to be tied tightly to the United States at this point? And I love the United States. I lived there for 5 years. Have lots of friends there, and ran an investment bank which was partly owned by Wells Fargo Bank. But I think the US foreign policy is just nuts at the moment. And I'm very keen for New Zealand not to line up alongside the US in a fight with China.
Yeah, well, me neither. I mean, how do you see New Zealand navigating that? Because, I mean, we've got a long history of, I guess, we had the anti-nuclear thing, sort of a step away from the ANZUS project. I mean, what do you think that looks like? Is it...
At the moment, you've got in both the Prime Minister and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Winston Peters, and indeed Minister of Defence, Judith Collins, who I know very well personally. We entered Parliament the same day in 2002. Yes. Three people, all of whom seem very keen indeed to sort of re-establish close relationships with the United States. I think that's very regrettable indeed. And Helen Clark and I, from different sides of the aisle, have been making some headlines by jointly writing op-eds and issuing joint press statements deploring that. And say, since we were political enemies, that's got a bit of publicity.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I'm certainly, that is something that concerns me. As I said, you know, I have a lot of connections to China myself, and I don't think a hot war or anything like that is something we want to entertain whatsoever. And my concern as well, Don, and this is maybe a bit of a simple take, but with all of the internal and fiscal issues that the United States is facing, it seems like the answer, more often than not, is to go and blow another country away as an easy way to stimulate their own economy and kind of export the problem. I don't know, is there any truth in that, do you think?
I just think US foreign policy has been bad for a long time. If you want a good analysis of foreign policy, which is not up to date exactly, but a book written by William Fulbright, who, of course, gave his name to the Fulbright Scholarships, was for 15 years, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, wrote a book called The Arrogance of Power. It was just extraordinarily perceptive view of the US throwing its weight around, written in 1966, a long time ago.
Yeah, no, I think you do mention that actually in Incredible Luck in your book.
I may do, I can't recall.
Yeah, you know, I think you do. And I recall looking at it because, it was sort of, it would have been right on the Vietnam period.
That's right. But it's been republished, because the book hasn't been changed very much, but republished just recently with a forward by Bill Clinton.
Yeah. So, just finally then, on the sort of note of the geopolitical situation, and then obviously a lot of your work, you mentioned Task Force 2025 in your book as well, and sort of this idea of kind of increasing or reducing the gap between New Zealand and Australia, increasing New Zealand's prosperity generally. What do you see as some maybe high-level takeaways or approaches to that we can explore?
You mean the prospect of achieving that, you mean?
Yeah, like how do we get New Zealand going again?
Well, how long have you got?
I got time if you got time, but...
No, it's a serious issue. Our productivity growth in New Zealand has been disappointing for a long time.
Yeah.
And that's a result of a whole range of things, educational failure, fascination with house prices, where we don't invest in things other than housing. That's seen as a low-risk, high-return investment, and that's not productive in terms of longer-term growth. The Resource Management Act, which we have in New Zealand, as you know, is a major impediment to growth. The Overseas Investment Office used to be called the Overseas Investment Commission, and I was ex officio a member of it as governor of the Reserve Bank, and we used to pride ourselves on how fast we could get these applications through. In fact, David Cagle, who was, of course, Minister of Finance after Roger Douglas, seriously suggested scrapping it. He said, why do we need an Overseas Investment Commission? You know, as long as they're not criminals, we don't care. But he was he was the most right-wing politician I think I've served under, even though he was Labour. Yeah. But, those are sort of major impediments to investment and to growth, in my view.
Yeah, well, I mean, sort of, again, I do reflect on a lot of the work you were involved in and how that led into my period, say, coming in high school, university, and sort of what I saw happening around me, and then what I see today, looking back on New Zealand, and I think, man, it seems like a basket case, and I'm sorry, like it just really politically and socially, there's just so much noise. And again, your work with Hobson's Pledge is very interesting to me as well, because you would think that we could work together to build up our country, and it seems like that's not happening, and it's sort of falling apart. And there's still this myth that somehow we're on par with Australia, for example, but it's certainly not the case.
No.
And I had someone say to me recently, it's probably more apt to compare New Zealand to former Soviet bloc countries in terms of living standards, quality of infrastructure, etc.
Yeah, in some respect, that's right, sadly.
Yeah. And so I guess on the social side as well, I mean, the Hobson's Pledge project has sort of caught a little bit of flack in the media recently, but I mean, I think the principles of every New Zealander having equal rights seem pretty clear cut. I mean, where do you think the dissidence comes from, and sort of the negative attitude towards that?
Oh, I think over a period of decades, successive governments have been willing to concede a special status to those with the Maori ancestor. And I say those with the Maori ancestor because, of course, there are no full-blooded Maori left. And very few 50% Maori. But I look at the cabinet, 20 members of cabinet, 7 of whom are Maori. None of them got there in a Maori electorate. They got there on their own merit. Winston Peters, Shane Jones, David Seymour, and so on. So they didn't require special coddling. They're perfectly capable of standing on their own 2 feet, of course you'd expect, because they're in every respect competent, intelligent, etc. New Zealanders. So I just think it's patronising to pretend that Maori can't get a voice unless they have a Maori electorate or a Maori ward. Maori wards have just become a big issue in the last few weeks, and it will be a big issue over the next 12 months, in fact.
Yeah, well, I find that quite fascinating. I grew up in the Hawke's Bay, and I'm part Maori myself, Don, and I've always thought of it as it should and it must be a meritocracy. You must be able to perform and do, try your best and not be stuck with a label or any of these things.
Yeah.
And again, I grew up in Hawke's Bay, in a very poor area, very Maori community, and it sort of seems as if the government's mollycoddling, as you say, it sort of, in a sense, has actually exacerbated the problem.
Well, my partner is a councillor, Western Bay District Council, Western Bay Plenty. By chance, they've just had a by-election, and the person who won was a young Maori woman. Wasn't a Maori ward. She stood in a general ward, and she won. And one of her close colleagues is another Maori who also won in a general ward. So the idea that unless they have a Maori ward, they can't get their voice heard is just patent nonsense.
Yeah. Well, I found it interesting. You're coming back to the Maori electorate, the rationale you gave for that, which was that Maori back in the early period or the late 19th century, unless you were a landowner, you weren't eligible to vote. This prior to universal suffrage, and so the Maori electorates were built to kind of service that, where when there was collectively owned land, there could still be a vote heard. So in fact, that's no longer relevant, as you say, arguably, you argue in the book, in the era of universal suffrage.
It's interesting, when Bill English was leader back in 2003, before he became Prime Minister later, he promised the next national government would scrap Maori electorates. I campaigned on the same theme, so did John Key. And when I talked to Tariana Turia, who was the leader at that point of the Maori Party, she was looking at supporting me in a coalition. And I said, how do you feel about abolishing Maori electorates? She said, finish the settlement of Maori grievances through the free settlement process, and I'm very comfortable. And our policy had been to have one more year in which tribes could lodge claims. This is 2005. 5 more years to resolve them after that. So 6 years' time, we hoped all the historical settlements would be dealt with. She said, I'm quite comfortable with that. We can scrap Maori electorates at that point. And actually, I visited her recently. She's a lovely lady, but unfortunately, she's got early signs of dementia. She's memory's going. But my co-spokesperson for Hobson's Pledge used to be Casey Costello. She's now in the cabinet, so I had to recruit someone else.
Yeah.
The guy I've got is a guy called Elliot Ekeley. I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he's part Maori, Pacific Islander, and part European. He's married to a Chinese from Singapore. He said, my children reflect the new New Zealand, representing the main four ethnic groups in New Zealand. And he said, that's fantastic.
Yeah. I sort of wonder, as I say, I have kind of feet in both camps. I some of my social circle and my friends, certainly the recent Hobson's Pledge stuff got them very irate.
Yeah.
And then I do look at it critically, and I ask the question, and I say, well, what is the issue here? And if I can be a bit frank about it, it seems as if it's a bit of a creeping Marxism or a resentment towards New Zealand itself, perhaps.
Yeah, and a lot of it goes back to the speech I gave at the Rewa Rotary Club back in 2004, which I thought was simply a restatement of National Party policy, but it created an earthquake. I don't know how old you are, but if you're young, you won't have heard of it, but it was made a huge splash at the time, to the point where Ariwa became a date rather than a place.
Yeah, yeah.
Things happened before Ariwa, after Ariwa.
Yeah.
And that's what got me branded as a racist. Until that point, I'd never really given a speech on the subject at all. It hadn't been an issue which had focused my mind at all. I was focused on economics and so on.
Well, that's the thing about economics is it's colorblind, right? And if you can trade,
well, that's right,
and you can work together, it's sort of a non-issue, right? But it's become an issue, and I just wonder. I mean, there's kind of negative topics, Don, but I guess sort of maybe looking to wrap this up a little bit. But what can we look at in terms of hope? I guess bringing New Zealand back, kind of getting away from this cultural war, which to me honestly seems imported. It doesn't seem like a homegrown thing. How do we move on from this? How do we rebuild this society?
I wish I knew how that could be accomplished without further tension.
Yeah.
I mean, at the moment, in fact, just before we came on air, on this call, I was looking at a debate between Matthew Hooton and a guy called Damien Grant. And Matthew Hooton was attacking me aggressively. I know Matthew very, very well, blaming me, calling me a racist and so on. And Damien Grant was defending me. I seriously think taking defamation actually against Hooton. I'm not very seriously thinking of it, but it was a very aggressive attack. And it pissed me off no end. The bill which David Seymour is proposing to put on the House shortly, the so-called Treaty Principles Bill, will bring the matter to a head, I think. What did the treaty provide? Did it envisage all New Zealanders being equal, or did it not? And that's the fundamental question which we have to resolve.
And I often do wonder, Don, whether the decline in New Zealand, certainly you sort of squint your eyes and you look at Australia and then you come back to New Zealand and you think, man, these state houses and these old roads, and it just feels like it's from the 60s and 70s, that period which I thought we had kind of traversed in the new New Zealand. And I just wonder whether economics plays a role here. If New Zealand was a more prosperous nation, whether a lot of these issues would go away potentially. Yeah,
you could be right. I don't know the answer to that question, but you could well be right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, I guess my final question then, Don, are you reading anything at the moment, or you're watching anything that
I've tended to listen to Audible books as I drive to and from Auckland. That's a good way of listening to books, and I tend to listen to a lot of books about American politics.
Yeah.
The whole Trump saga, and not long ago finished Liz Cheney's book, Oath and Honor. Yeah. Great book. So I spent a lot of time listening to that sort of stuff. What else have I read recently? Well, I read, of course, a couple of years ago now, Graham Allison's book, Destined for War. Have you read that?
No.
If you haven't read that, it's worth reading. It's a classic. Actually, it was written in 2017. The book is called Destined for War, Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? Ignorance, I didn't know who Thucydides was, but he was a Greek historian in the 4th or 5th century BC. And he wrote about the challenge which Athens posed to Sparta. Sparta was the established power of the era, Athens the rising power. Eventually went to war and both were destroyed. Then after talking about the rise of China, he looks back over 500 years and finds 16 cases where a dominant power was challenged by a rising power, and in 12 of the 16, war was the result. Now, clearly, America has been the dominant power for a number of decades. China is equally clearly the rising power. Can they escape that almost inevitability of war? And right now, it's not very encouraging.
Yeah, no, it's certainly concerning. Though I do hope cool heads prevail, and maybe we can get through it. I'm certainly. Have you come across The Fourth Turning as a book, Don?
No.
So The Fourth Turning is similar to what you just described. It sort of looks at history in these sort of 120-year cycles, and with generations that kind of each generation almost has like an archetype to it. And so the generation immediately post-war is extremely anti-war, and then they sort of forget over time. And it seems as if we're coming up to a bit of a fourth turning where it's sort of 100 to 80 years on from the Second World War, where, it's almost just a historical artifact now. There's very few people who are still living from that period to tell the story, and we're kind of destined potentially to repeat the mistakes of the past.
Yeah. I worry that in the West, there's almost no knowledge of Asian history, even Chinese history. And I didn't know much about Chinese history except the Opium War. But of course, right through the rest of the 19th century, a number of European powers invaded China, took chunks of China, and then Japan did, and took a chunk of both mainland China and Taiwan. When I was, as a chairman of the Chinese Bank, we had a speech competition in May 2019. What's that about? It's the centenary of a student revolt in May 1919. And so what was the student revolt about? They said that was the students revolting about the fact that the Treaty of Versailles had handed German-occupied China to Japan. And the students, unsurprisingly, said, what the is going on here? This is mainland China, occupied by Germany. We were supporting the Allies in the First World War, but you hand German territory to our enemy across the sea in Japan.
Was that parts of Shanghai, the German part of Shanghai, that got handed over?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure. Yeah. I gather there was a chunk of China which was controlled by Germany, which was handed to Japan.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I actually, many years ago, I read Henry Kissinger's book on China, which is a huge volume, and it gives a comprehensive history. It's very interesting, certainly from a US perspective. I'm not sure what you thought. Did you ever meet Henry Kissinger?
No.
Talk about, warfare. Certainly the master there, but on both sides of the world. But I thought it was a very interesting historical study, at least.
Funny enough, I was given a copy of Kissinger's book on China just earlier this week.
I see.
By a student who's been studying in Singapore.
I see. Well, look, Don, I don't want to hold you up from your day, but I do really appreciate you sharing your story and some of your thoughts on these topics, and what you're working on now. It's been very fascinating for me, and I'm passionate about what is in store for New Zealand and for the world, and I am sort of optimistic, I must say. There's sort of, even though there is a lot of tension, I believe there are ways out of this that can be peaceful and prosperous, and I hope we can work towards those. Is there anything else you wanted to add or share while I've got you?
Don't think so.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed the conversation.
No, much appreciated. And if you do remember the name of that economist who helped inform Roger Douglas's thoughts, I would love to know.
Actually, I think I can find it out. I still retain quite close contact with Michael Bassett.
Yes.
Who was a member of that fourth Labour government.
Yeah.
And it was he who put me onto the guy, and I corresponded with him for quite a while.
Yeah.
So I'll try and get the name for him and send you an email.
Sweet. All right. Thank you very much, Don. I'll leave you to it.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. I do hope you enjoyed the show. I am Cody Ellingham, and that was the transformation of value. If you would like to get in touch, please send me an email at hello@thetransformationofvalue.com, and I will get back to you.